Aris Hadjistefanu, thank you very much for coming to the Listening Post.
Thank you for having me.
Job cuts, shutdowns of channels, shutdowns of newspapers. The media landscape in Greece has been affected by the financial landscape. Could you explain to us what it was about the structure of the media industry in Greece that led to this bubble to burst so dramatically?
The main problem with Greek media landscape is that these organizations were never really profitable. They could receive cheap loans from the banks and they could rely on public infrastructure. After the beginning of the crisis, when the advertisement market collapsed, it was only big banks that they had some money to pay for advertisement in private stations. And at the same time, they were the only one who could give money as loans to these corporations. So what's the result of that? Greek taxpayers pay for bailing out the banks who give money to the mainstream media to promote their propaganda and to promote the idea that we should support austerity and that we should bail out the banks. So you see here this vicious circle.
There's a larger point here about media ownership. We've seen countries, for example, like Turkey. Media outlets are owned by big conglomerates that do business with the government. How do you think coverage of political stories are affected by these kinds of relationships?
If you see the latest report from organizations like Reporters Without Borders, you'll see that after the beginning of the crisis, we fell 50 places in the index of press freedom. Can you imagine that? 50 places. We have now many countries that are non-democratic regimes and they enjoy more freedom of press than what journalists enjoy in the country where democracy was born.
One of these stories coming out of the media has been the shutdown of state TV, ERT. It was taken off air last year. Now, the government's argument is that it's financially unviable. What would you say to that?
It's a huge lie. If you see the information that we received from journalists working at ERT, with a very small budget, they had more than 5 radio stations, they had 2 TV stations promoting information to all corners of Greece. Even though it was owned and controlled by the state, I would say that ERT was less biased than private TV stations, and that was something that the Greek government could not accept anymore.
Most of the people we speak to tend to say that state media usually doesn't favour the public and tends to back the government. You seem to be arguing, however, that there was a valuable contribution being made journalistically by this channel instead of it just being a mere vehicle of the state.
Many people characterize the ERT as a propaganda machine, and at some points it was true. They promoted the same austerity agenda, they promoted the same politicians for years and years. But if you compare it with the private channels, then you realize that there was a higher level of journalism in the state broadcaster. ERT didn't have to rely on other private corporations to get money from advertisement or loans from the banks. So it had an independence that you cannot find in the private sector. You know, there was a joke a few years ago, which is not a joke, unfortunately, anymore, that our parents and our grandparents had to rely on BBC World Service or Deutsche Welle to understand what's going on in their country during the German occupation or during the dictatorship. I'm afraid the same thing happens now in Greece. We have to watch Al Jazeera or BBC or read The Guardian to learn what's going on a few hundred meters from our houses.
3 years ago, you were sacked from Sky Media, one of the biggest outlets in Greece. They say the reason was economic. You say it was because you refused to toe the line. What story was it that you were trying to tell?
What I was doing, it was just to work on international affairs. So I was explaining what was happening in countries like Ecuador, Iceland, where they defaulted, where they didn't accept what the IMF was asking from them, or they nationalized the banks, or they stopped being members of monetary unions in the same way that we are members of Eurozone. There are hundreds of journalists promoting alternative points of view to current affairs that lost their position in mainstream media. I think that the crisis was a unique opportunity for media owners to get rid of people who wouldn't accept the austerity policy, wouldn't accept what the Greek government wanted to implement against the Greek population.
You've made two films, Debtocracy and Katastroika, and they're both films that are dedicated to telling this story of capital and late capitalism. What is it about your films that's not being said in the mainstream media? And more importantly, why is it that they don't want to discuss it?
In our first documentary, Debtocracy, we were explaining that there are other solutions to debt crisis, that you can default, you can exit the Eurozone or any other monetary union, that it's not a sin to have a debt. It's not the same thing as having a personal debt, because that's what the media are trying to say to countries that find themselves in the trap of debt. No one wanted to listen about this story in Greece, and probably it's not a coincidence that many journalists that we worked for this documentary lost their jobs during a very small period of weeks or months.
One question about you, the way that you do your documentaries, the voices that you line up, they're all very much part of the left. You do not use a model which suggests a counterpoint. So this is very much a mode of denunciation. Do you not feel that there's a problem with that kind of representation?
From the first moment, we explained to our viewers and to our audience that we are not going to be balanced in the way that someone would expect to have both opinions at the same documentary. And why we did that? We said to the people that you are listening to the other point of view, from the mainstream media every single day. You are reading for that in the newspapers, you are listening to the same stories at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock news. So we have enough time to bring you the other side of the story, to bring you alternative solutions.
Aris Hagistefanou, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me.